Greetings, all you lovers of lore and legend, whether student, teacher, parent, teller of tales, or farcical aquatic ceremony enthusiasts.
Great Tales is a podcast about myths and legends from both inside and outside the Christian tradition, and we come to you live twice a month to talk about these great stories that Christians have been reading and passing on for centuries, sometimes even longer than that.
Last time, we talked with our friend Deacon Nicholas Kotar about 2 Russian fairy tales, and this time, we are going to dive headlong into the vast waters of the legends of the Blessed Isle of Albion, named, by the way, after a giant, the Holy Kingdom of Logres, the Matter of Briton itself, Arthur, the Dux Bellorum, the King of the Britons, the Rex Quondam et Futurus, the once and future king.
Yeah, and this will be the first of likely...
Oh, so many episodes.
Not necessarily in a row, but many episodes in which we're going to discuss the Arthurian legends. So if we don't get to whatever is your most favorite thing today, we almost certainly will in the future. But we decided to focus today on the most famous, the most legendary, the most glorious of them all, the Holy Grail.
I definitely would say that this is sort of the Holy Grail of subject matter for me, so to speak.
It's so recursive.
Yes, I know. All right, so a couple of things real quick before we get into things. First of all, a shout out to, I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was. Last week, somebody donated some money so that poor Matushka Trudy would no longer have to look at my plaid shirt.
That's right.
And so I have acquired, now I didn't spend the money that you donated, that went to Ancient Faith. I have acquired with my own money a topical t-shirt for today's episode. And
I think you should stand up and really show it to them.
So you guys
there you go.
See. All right, here we go. So I've got a very topical Holy Grail t-shirt to wear today for this episode.
Straight out of a medieval manuscript illumination.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And as long as I am allowed to wear t-shirts on air, which may not be forever, but as long as I'm allowed to do so, if you guys donate to Ancient Faith, I will acquire, with my own money, I will acquire topical t-shirts for future episodes. So please make that a thing. It would be a fun kind of and kind of a funny way to support the ministry. So
yeah, and let's increase Richard's wardrobe by making
donations. Also, I really just actually do need more shirts. I really apparently just got the 3. So
you're a growing boy, Richard. So
you've
outgrown, and I'm sure you're doing hand-me-downs to your numerous progeny.
Well, my oldest son is 7, so he's not quite big enough to fit my stuff. But in like another year or 2, he will be. He's pretty big.
There we go. So I think we should start with talking some general bits about the Arthurian legendarium, because we haven't talked about that yet at all.
Yep.
So I think it's one of these stories that in the English-speaking world, everybody knows King Arthur. And if you were to say, okay, well, tell me a King Arthur story, it's interesting. They might well mention the Grail. That would probably be in terms of percentage, the Grail is going to get mentioned. They might mention Lancelot. They might mention Excalibur.
Yeah, the Sword of the Stone is probably the story that most people could tell.
Yeah,
I mean,
which by the way, everybody, we should do an Excalibur episode, or one that definitely incorporates Excalibur. Because there's actually 2 origin stories for Excalibur.
I have some crazy stuff. I mean, stuff that will blow people's socks right off of their feet.
That's right. So you can donate towards socks for Richard as well.
I have some insane Excalibur stuff that I think people are not prepared for. But yeah,
I think that the Arthurian legendarium is fascinating because it's one of these sets of traditions that people know, but there's not one thing that it is. There's not a single text you can point at. Like the Iliad is the text for the Trojan War, although there's other texts. But it's the text. There's lots of stories and legends where there's a main text, but there really isn't for Arthur. And
yes, right.
You could point to Mallory, for instance, Mort d'Arthur, and maybe that's the text on some level. But by the time you get to Mallory, if you're not into Arthurian lore, you may not know this. By the time we get to Mallory, who is the one who kind of codifies the way that we think about Arthur now, Arthur is centuries and centuries old by that point.
Yeah, so Mallory's Le Morte is ostensibly written in Middle English, but the Middle English period is actually really broad, and Mallory is closer to the English of Shakespeare than he is to the English of Chaucer, for instance.
Yeah.
And so
It's late Middle English.
You can read Mallory without translation. You or should be able to.
It would take a little work, especially if you're not familiar with early modern English, late Middle English.
Yeah.
But I mean, like there's and it's amazing how much variety there is if you look at the various sources of Arthurian literature. Like you've got the Welsh stuff from the Mabinogion and so forth.
Yeah.
You've got obviously there's a whole world of French stuff going on there.
So even the Welsh thing is tricky because what happens? So let me try to lay it out just a little bit. So
Okay.
in Western Europe during the Middle Ages, you have three main cycles of stories that are the matter of what they would have called romances, which does not mean kissy stories, although the most is this a kissing book? Yes, it is.
As you
okay,
wish.
we're supposed to be doing Monty Python references, by the way, today.
I'm totally fine with Princess Bride jokes as well.
Okay, all right. So the most successful kinds of romances from the Middle Ages are the ones that have to do with love, and specifically with courtly love, and that's sort of why the word romance eventually. Well, it's not the reason why, but it's the reason prior to the reason why nowadays when we say a romance, we mean something like a story where a guy meets a girl and they fall in love.
Right, but romance is really like an adventure story. It's really what it comes down to. Like The Tempest. The Tempest in the Shakespearean play, The Tempest is a romance. There does happen to be a love story in it, but that's not what it's.
It doesn't just mean an adventure story though. What it means is a story which is self-consciously fictitious.
Okay.
So obviously these are often stories of adventures, but The Tempest is a good example of this. The reason that The Tempest is called a romance is because obviously a lot of Shakespeare's plays were historical, matter. Now you can agree or disagree about whether or not it's
they're
legitimate.
about historical figures.
And the ones that weren't historical were often tragedies and comedies, which are their own kinds of things. And those can be fictitious stories, but a romance is neither. Now, this isn't like the technical Aristotelian sense. It's neither a tragedy nor a comedy, right? And so that's really what it sort of emerges in the Middle Ages as its own genre of storytelling, which is focused usually on the deeds of warrior aristocrats and also is self-consciously a fictional story.
Yeah,
so,
and I'll also say, by the way, for those of you who might be wondering, like you might think you know the difference between a tragedy and a comedy when you're talking about literature from this period. And I don't know how much this reaches back into the Middle Ages, but like when you're talking Shakespeare, here's your shorthand for tragedies and comedies. In tragedies, most people, or at least the most important people, die at the end. Comedies, there's weddings at the end. It's not about it being funny. There's often funny bits in all of these,
that's right.
stories. I don't know if this works in terms of definitions going back to.
That's the Aristotelian. That's the Aristotelian definition. Basically, is that a tragedy starts up here and goes down here.
Yep.
And then a comedy usually goes in a U or sometimes starts low and ends high. That's why the Divine Comedy, which we will definitely talk about in this show. That's why the Divine Comedy is the Divine Comedy. It's because
it's a real knee slapper because it's just endless humor.
Well, there are some funny fart jokes in the Divine Comedy for sure.
That's right.
We
should have given a parental advisory before mentioning.
Listen, there is some stuff in the Arthurian legends that does come with a little bit of a parental advisory, which is why I was actually not allowed to read the stories as a kid. I did anyway. God forgive me, but there is something I'm going to talk about at the end today because it's actually really important to understanding the Holy Grail, and it's a secret hidden inside the text, but I want to mention it. So we'll get to that in a little bit.
Okay.
It's nothing explicit, but just so you know.
Okay, so what are the main sources of Arthurian legendarium? Because like I said, there's no one thing that is this
right.
Is Arthur.
So there's three cycles of romances in the medieval West. There's the Matter of Rome, which has to do with the Trojan War.
Yeah.
Troilus and Cresside is one of the most famous stories in the Middle English period, if we're talking the Anglophone world, which obviously has to do with the Trojan War. There's the Matter of Rome, Then there's the Matter of France. This is the story of Charlemagne and his paladins. This includes things like Tasso and people like this. Obviously, the Song of Roland is the earliest text, the kind of belonging to that body. And the thing that people don't always know, because we're speaking in an Anglophone world, and French things are, there's a long antagonistic relationship with French culture in the Anglophone world. So people don't always know French literature super well. But actually, in the Middle Ages, the Matter of France was as big as the Matter of Britain. However, and this is the tricky thing, so the Matter of Britain being the story that has to do with King Arthur, almost all of the stories of the Matter of Britain were written by people in France. Almost all the stories.
So embarrassing, Richard.
No.
It's
it's
so
not
embarrassing.
It's not
It
embarrassing.
is.
No,
it is. It totally is.
But the thing is, when you're telling these sort of legendary stories, it's really important that it happened kind of over there, right? So the Matter of Britain, all of the most famous stories come to us from French retelling. So like Mallory, who is definitely the dominant source in like the Anglophone world, he's working from what he calls the French book, which is a collection of French sources.
I mean, it makes sense. Like when you're talking about England, or I mean, this is sort of legendary England, magical England, holy England.
Right.
Logos.
Whoa! Look at you doing holy England. It's gonna wrinkle some brains. That's gonna wrinkle some brains. Yeah.
I mean, England in the European consciousness, or particularly the Roman consciousness, but I think it kind of gets into Europe's consciousness because of the way that the Romans encountered it, is this idea of this place that is on the very edge of the world.
Right.
It's filled with like sorcerers, and I mean, when I don't know if I remember if we mentioned this in a previous episode. Yeah, no, we did. In the last episode, when the Romans land on the beach in southeastern England, and they see the Britons there, like they're freaked out because they have like shaven heads and big mustaches.
That's right.
And they seem to be doing weird ceremonies on the beach. Like, so their first encounter with it is like, okay, these are crazy magical barbarians
with mustaches,
with big mustaches, Yeah. Like it is this other place, this magical place,
right? So the most of the Matter of Britain stories are written in France, but I'll come back to that. Almost all the most famous Matter of France stories, almost all are written by Italians, right? And then sort of Matter of Rome, it's kind of it belongs to everybody, so everybody can write about it because Troy is over there, right?
Yes.
All right, so there are, broadly speaking, and this is like really, really imprecise, three mainstreams of Arthurian storytelling. And there's no way to describe this that is not super unsatisfactory. Because, so you just mentioned like the Mabinogion. Well, the Mabinogion has both some of the earliest and also some of the latest Arthurian stories in it. Or at least the collection of texts that we call the Mabinoge. That it has the, because it has some of the earliest Arthurian stuff, but then there's a bunch of French romances that got rewritten by the Welsh, and the Welsh just added them to their collection of stories, right? And so some of the most famous Arthurian tales from the Mabinoge are actually French stories but here's the thing, that may have been based on earlier Celtic, either Bretonic, which would be northwestern coast of France, or Welsh substrate. So it's basically what you have happening with the whole Arthurian legend is you have probably a Celtic substrate. I say probably because I'll come back to this in a minute. You have probably a Celtic substrate, and then French stories were written on top of that, and then more Celtic retellings of the French stories, and then eventually you get an English synthesis. Yeah, so Arthur is not the king of England, he's the king of the Britons. Very important distinction there. One of his main opponents is the infidel, which means my Anglo-Saxon ancestors who were pagans at the time.
Yeah, there's this like, the story of Arthur keeps kind of jumping back and forth across the English Channel.
Right.
Or as they call it in French, la manche, the big sleeve.
The big sleeve.
Yeah. It's just like, the English call it the English Channel, and so that's why we call it that. But the French do not call it the English Channel. Just like the Persian Gulf. It's funny, we call it the Persian Gulf, but pretty much everybody on the other side of it calls it the Arabian Gulf. Big shocker. Everybody claims that it belongs to them.
Right. And we're about to rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of Texas.
Gulf of Florida, yeah. I've heard about that, actually.
Yeah.
What kind of weird legends are jumping back and forth between Texas and Florida, Richard? I don't know.
That's the thing. So now like I said, there's a wrinkle in all of this, which is what does Khabib Nurmagomedov, oh boy, I can't say his name today. That's real bad. Nurmagomedov have to do with King Arthur. So, do you know who Khabib is? Father Andrew?
I have known people named Habib.
I know
I was in seminary with a guy named Habib.
I would assume you were at seminary with more than one person named Habib. So
no, just one named Habib, yeah.
So this particular Khabib, aka the Eagle, is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, UFC fighters of all time. Okay. So I figured out a way to sneak the UFC into our little podcast that we're doing here today, which is very exciting for me.
And that's the United Federation of Chimpanzee Trainers, or
you're really close. It's the Ultimate Fighting Championship.
Oh, okay.
And
people pummeling each other.
People pummeling each other like chimpanzees. So it's the Ultimate Fighting Championship. I think most people who follow me online know that I both watch and also practice mixed martial arts. And there's so Khabib is one of the biggest fighters in the UFC. Had this incredible 29-0 undefeated record. Fought all the greats of his time and everything. And now he coaches other guys who are also great. So
you know what Habib means in Arabic?
Beloved, right?
Yeah. Well, beloved,
like
darling.
Yeah,
darling. Sweetheart. Yeah. Habibi,
yeah.
my darling.
Yeah.
Habibti as if it's a woman.
Oh yeah, there you go. So so. Somebody noticed the other day, and they made a little meme of this, that so a couple of weeks ago we had a really stacked UFC card. Well, like I said, a couple of weeks ago, like Saturday night, we had a really stacked UFC card. So there were a bunch of titles that were up for contention, a bunch of really, really big fights, and people sort of noticed, hey, wait a minute, all the fighters that are in this, there was another one of the big fighters that was originally on the card that we had to pull out because of an injury, is Arman Tsarukyan, which is a good Armenian name.
Yeah.
Yep. And
I can play this game pretty well.
I know. So you've got, but here's the thing. People started to notice, wait a minute, almost every big fighter in this card, and this has been true in the FDIC,
You see the FDIC?
Ooh, boy, it's been a long week.
Please let that be true.
No, this has been true in the UFC for years now, is that 80% of the fighters on the roster come from one side or other of the Caucasus Mountains. Okay. So, one way to sort of interpret this is to say that all of the most bellicose people in the world, the people who like fighting the most, there's literally a video out there of Khabib learning to wrestle with a young bear, because that's how his father trained him, like in the mountains of Dagestan,
wrestling with bears, eating beets, watching Battlestar Galactica.
There you go. And the reason I bring this up is because there is a strong possibility that the entire Arthurian, you could say legendarium as such, has down at its deepest roots is a series of Alanic stories brought by a group of people called the Alans, who are a northern Caucasian people from the northern Caucasus Mountains, which is modern-day Dagestan, where Khabib is from, by mercenaries in the service of Rome. And if people want to investigate this theory for themselves, there's a book out there called From Scythia to Camelot. There's a lot of very compelling evidence in the story, which includes what is possibly, I would even say probably, the origin of animals as heraldic devices in Western Europe, which is actually a pretty unusual thing in world cultures. But certain very important figures, including Lancelot and maybe Arthur himself, might actually come from these groups of northern Caucasian mercenaries who were brought to the British Isles and to northern France in the service of Rome, and who are sort of integrated with the local Celtic
I feel like I've heard this theory before, that the stories come from the Alans.
Yeah.
I can't remember where I read that now. But
it's an interesting theory, and I will share some more about that in a future episode. But just to say that the the various streams of the Arthurian story, it's not really correct to talk about them as you have this thing that builds on this thing that builds on this thing that builds on
No.
this thing. It is really
No.
more like, really it is streams, and they kind of weave in and out of each other. And in fact, I think that the best way to understand Arthurian storytelling just in general, I'll give more examples of this in a moment, is if you look at like medieval Celtic knotwork, where you have all these lines that kind of crisscross in and outside of each other. And if you follow any single line, it can be really, really confusing. But then if you step back from it and you look, the whole thing as a whole makes a pattern. And this is how the Arthurian legends are. If you just look at them, if you try to just look at one thread like we're going to do today, it's almost overwhelming. I have 24 pages of notes that we will not get through all.
That's right.
Today.
I know, and the Grail is a great example. Like the earliest texts that we have that are Arthurian, there is no Grail.
That's right.
Like this is not part of, or even like stuff that we as 21st century Americans who love the Arthurian stuff would think is like absolutely critical and essential to the Arthurian legendarium, like Lancelot.
Right.
He's a Johnny come lately,
Maybe, but
maybe,
yes.
okay, maybe,
but yes, maybe, yeah.
But that's how it seems. I have a chart somewhere actually of all the various critical elements of Arthurian legend and when they actually came in.
So it's tricky because there are sort of theories that Lancelot and Arthur were maybe originally the same person and they actually split. And so anyway, let's not spend
Which makes
too
a
much
lot
time
of
doing
sense considering the love triangle. But yes, let's not get into that.
Let's not spend too much time doing source criticism, but I will return to some of this in a future episode. So the story of the Holy Grail or the San Graal or the Graal Santel or a bunch of different names for it.
Come on, I want to hear you say it in Welsh.
It is. It is no. There's a certain branch of Celtic languages which I personally believe, and this is my official opinion as a philologist, are a cruel joke played by the Almighty upon the people of the British Isles.
Those are the Brythonic tongues.
And I really, really struggle with those particular languages. But in any case, the Grail as the Grail, let's say as such, and when I say as such, I'm going to come back and qualify that in a second, because most of the things that people take for granted about the Holy Grail are not there in the original version of the story.
Right. Like what even is it? What even kind of thing is it?
Yeah. So I'll talk about that in a second. So we'll get there when we get there.
I know.
It's it first appears in a story written by Chrétien de Troyes, and it first appears in a story that he wrote called Perceval, the Story of the Grail. Right.
Which I have to say, by the way, his name, like if you translate it, which you shouldn't, but if you translate it into English, it literally means Christian of Troy. But it's not Troy like Troy. It's Troyes, which is actually a place in France.
Right. But I mean, that's not accidental, I think. Anyway, symbolism happens.
There you go.
So this is written in the late 12th century, and it is technically unfinished.
Yeah.
And I'll come back to that in a moment. Over the course of many centuries since then, the story of the Grail has been told and retold. They started retelling it basically as soon as Chrétien finished it. And so because of that, there's all kinds of what are called the continuations. There are 3 medieval continuations that were all written within a decade or two of when Chrétien finished the story, because they they weren't happy with the end of the story. They wanted to add more on. And then about 80 years later, the story is retold again in full in Perceval, and it just goes on and like that. And basically, there's not been a single century for the last 800 or so years. There hasn't been a single century that has not given us multiple treatments of this story, right? And
although it's funny because, like, again, if you're going to sit down with your focus group of people who are into pop culture and have some sense of Arthur, and say, okay, name the big characters, whatever, Perceval's name would probably not be mentioned unless you got somebody who studied this,
right? Perceval is the original, what we could call a Grail Knight. Galahad is the one that is much better known later on.
Yeah.
And we're not going to talk about what that is today. But this is before any Galahad. This is before even, it's not before Lancelot's been introduced to the because obviously, Chrétien wrote a bunch of Lancelot stories before he wrote this. But Lancelot doesn't really come up in the story. He's not very important in it.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the reasons that I am so interested, some would say obsessed with the Grail legends, is that they are a beautiful window into, and the Arthurian Legendarium, I think in general, especially for English-speaking people, we're going to do non-Anglophone stories as part of this show. I have Ethiopian stuff planned. I have Georgian stuff planned.
Yeah, that's one of the questions we've gotten the most is like, are you going to do
Yeah.
stuff that's outside of the European whatever? We're like,
Yeah,
yeah, of course. I mean, probably there's going to be more
right.
European related stuff, but that's just because that's our cultural inheritance. But absolutely,
Right,
we're going
and
to go outside.
yeah, exactly. But the Arthurian stuff, as an example for the Anglophone world of what would it look like to build mythology and tell those kinds of stories, romances, fantasy, etc., in a totally Christian context. And when I say that, I really mean this on multiple levels. So first of all, these are self-consciously romances. They're self-consciously fictitious,
Fiction.
imaginative stories. Nobody is reading this and being like, oh, there really was a guy named Perceval who, like, even Perceval's name, as I will reveal at the end dramatically, is an allegorical name.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like one of the big, and I mean, this is very interesting to me. Like we might call it the quest for the historical Arthur.
Yeah.
That's very interesting to me, but
Sure, yeah.
it's kind of not the point.
It's really beside the point. It might be interesting kind of for its own sake.
Yeah.
But it's not really what it's about. So the other reason that this is so interesting to me, though, is that there is a very strong case to be made. And in the old days of, say the old days, like the 18th, 19th centuries, this was what people used to call, I know, for academia, maybe it is, though. Yeah. In the old days, this is what people used to call the Byzantine school of Grail studies. Now,
right,
this is
raise your hand, kids, if you've ever even heard of that.
Yeah, well, obviously, we've all
heard of it. Yes.
So nowadays, when people do Arthuriana in academia, they're mainly interested in questions of gender and power, and those are the only things that people really talk about. And so, the Byzantine school of Grail studies has fallen out of favor.
Yeah.
But essentially, the argument of the Byzantine school of Grail studies and is that the legends of the Holy Grail are related to or ultimately have their source in the Greek Christian Orthodox East. And that they are related to a number of relics, which each in their own way have to do with the body and the blood of Christ. So
I know. I remember when you told me this the first time, because I'd never heard this. I'd never heard of it.
Most people haven't heard it. Yeah.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
What?
And the connection is between, and I'll do more about this in a future episode. So I'm just going to introduce the concept right now.
Make it today.
I know.
A lot of
Listen, I'll just make podcasts forever. I don't care.
You're hired.
Yeah, exactly. So, one of the early examples of this is in the earliest Celtic retellings of the Grail story. The Grail is not one item. Actually, this is the way it is in Perceval as well. The Grail is not just one item. The Grail is actually multiple items. So in the Celtic retelling, it is sometimes a chalice. Sometimes it is a stone, like a stone altar. Sometimes it is a gem, maybe of some kind. Sometimes it's a sacring bell. It can be these different things. But these are all things.
Also, like, do the Celts do also? Isn't it like a platter, that you could put a fish on, or is that?
So that's what it is in
French thing?
That's what it is in Perceval today. And it's tricky when you say, is that a French thing? Because actually, the word Grail is a Celtic word, but it's not a British Isles Celtic word. It's a Pyrenees Celtic word.
Oh.
Yeah.
And it's
Celts really got around back in the day.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, Galatia probably means the Celts that basically lived in what is now Turkey.
We have our people everywhere.
Yeah. But, it's interesting. And if people kind of wonder about this, like, wait a second, I thought the Holy Grail was a chalice. Like, that's cool. It is a chalice. But it is also all of these other things.
It will not be a chalice in today's reading.
Yeah, and but if you look at a lot of Orthodox icons of the mystical supper,
Mm-hmm.
a lot. I'm not saying all of them, but a lot of them.
Yeah.
And you look in the middle of the table, Christ, in the center of the table, and then you look on the table itself, right in front of him. There is what looks like a platter on a pedestal, and often there's a fish lying on it.
Right.
And
Right.
this is not
Very famous Athonite.
decor.
Yeah.
This is not decor. This is the Holy Grail.
Right. So we're gonna come back to the platter and the
Okay.
fish because this is really, really important to
Yeah.
to Chrétien's telling of the story.
Yeah.
The thing that I'll mention though is that one of the earliest places that this Grail as kind of like this, it's like a cup-like dish,
Yeah.
but it's not quite a cup, it's not quite a plate. This dish, one of the most important places that this comes up is in church iconography that was being done in the Pyrenees in kind of a Greek style, coming up out of North Africa and Spain. And very often the Virgin is shown, especially in like icons of Ascension, she's shown holding this Grail in her hands, and there's like fire coming up out of it. And this seems to be, there is a book called The Virgin and the Virgin and the Grail. That's not very long. It's got all the archaeological evidence for this. Again, I'm not going to I don't want to trot too much of that out today, that we might talk about in the future, because the thing that I kind of want to hone in on here is that it seems very obvious to me, and it has been very obvious to people in the past, especially at a time in history when medievalists still went to church, which is not really the case anymore. But it seems very obvious to me that there are many elements of the Grail legends which are based on the divine liturgy. And just as an example, Philip, who's a crusader, he's Chrétien's patron. He died fighting at Acre, so in the Holy Land, he was a crusader, and that whole family, which is like the royal family, related to Eleanor of Aquitaine and all those other people, they were a crusader family. They had landholdings in the Middle East. And if Chrétien himself never saw a Byzantine-style liturgy, like an Eastern liturgy, certainly his patrons had.
Yeah. So I think, just to summarize this point, which I just find so delightful and fascinating that it is in fact true, is that this most recognizable element of the Arthurian legends has its origins in the Orthodox Christian world of the Christian East.
And one of the amazing things is that Chrétien says multiple times, or he says right at the beginning of the poem, that he's just copying this down. This part of this is like kind of like sort of stereotypical medieval poet humility, where you say, "Oh, I didn't come up with the story; I got it from so and so." But he says this: "I got this story from a book that Philip, my great patron, brought back for me." And there are scholars who believe, and I think that a convincing case can be made, there are scholars who believe that the book is in fact Saint Germanus of Constantinople's mystagogical commentary on the Divine Liturgy.
Wow.
And that is the book. So here's what I want to try to kind of lay out for people today. And this is the how do I put this? Like, this is the hardest thing that I'm going to say today, that people are going to struggle to understand the most. But if you can get this, then you're going to be able to appropriate, especially, this is an Orthodox podcast for an Orthodox audience. If other people are listening, God bless you. We're happy you're here. But what I have is kind of actually a unique opportunity where I can reasonably assume that most people who are listening to this right now have been to the Divine Liturgy, probably more than once. Okay.
And if you haven't, pause the podcast.
Right.
Go to church.
So.
Okay, welcome back.
There's a, right, yes, welcome back. Hope you had a good liturgy. We talked a little bit earlier about how there's these different ancient shapes to stories, right? The tragedy, the comedy, and so on. What I want to put out there, and this is really important for whatever the future, I believe, is really important for whatever the future of like Orthodox Christian literary criticism is going to be. is that there is also a kind of story. I'm not going to say it's every story, but it's every story. But there's a kind of story. It's all the truest stories. Let's put it that way. Do a little Tolkien-esque prevaricating. Well, the truest fairy tales. There is a kind of story which has what let's call a mystagogical shape, which is to say that the shape of the story itself is based on an experience of liturgy.
Yeah,
and that purpose
initiates you.
And the purpose of the story,
into this mystical life.
or the thing that the story is about the initiation into the mystical life.
Yeah.
And my argument, really my most important argument here, is that is what the Grail is, what the Grail story is, and in particular the way that Chrétien tells it, although later versions as well. So, kind of with that introduced, I want you to think about the structure of the liturgy as you know it, right? As you've experienced it, the way that the liturgy kind of has these 2 parts, maybe 3 parts, right? Where you've got the sort of like the liturgy of the catechumens or the liturgy of the word, which is where we start in this place outside of the church and we process into the church and we start to ascend the mountain until we get to, the gospel reading and then usually a homily if it's a Sunday, right? That is an initiation into one level of knowing, but then you're going to go beyond that, and you're going to continue to ascend the mountain into actually finally communion with God, which is different from just hearing about Him. Right?
Yeah, and I'll add, because a lot of people don't think about this, particularly laymen. Before even what you just mentioned, there is the proscomédie.
Yes.
Which is this whole other part of the liturgy that actually apparently historically used to be incorporated into the divine liturgy itself. And I think for the Oriental churches, it still is my understanding. I don't know. Write in Coptic, and Armenian friends, let us know. But the proscomédie is where the deacon and the priest, they prepare the bread and the wine, and there are the commemorations of the living and the departed. There's the commemorations of all the saints. All of this is going on, and in many ways, it's kind of the preparation for the gospel. It's fascinating how you get these various layers.
And so, if you look in the literature around the Byzantine school of Grail studies, there are links. A lot of people link the proscomédie and the Great Entrance, specifically those 2 things, to the Grail legends. Yeah, because there's a kind of an obvious parody between, or link between, the stone of preparation in Jerusalem, which is one of the things that the Grail is. The stone on which Christ was laid when He was prepared, which you can still see. I'm told. If you go to the Holy Sepulchre, I still haven't been able to make it out there yet.
Yeah, I haven't seen it personally, but
yes, I know I've seen pictures. I mean, I know it's there, but I just haven't been able to go yet. There was kind of like a link between that and then the table of preparation in the church.
And also, I know you're going to probably mention this, but just to keep hinting at stuff. That's also the point at which there's a spear.
Yeah. Yep. All right. So with that said, let's read. Do you want to read the first section?
Yeah. Okay.
So this is how the poem proper. There's a little bit of introduction to the beginning, but here's how the poem. Poem proper begins. It begins as all medieval stories do, that don't begin at Christmas. If they don't begin at Christmas, they begin in the spring.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also say, I'm not about to read to you in medieval French. This is a translation.
Yeah, this is a Burton Raffles translation, by the way, which you can find online. You can get a PDF of.
All right. The season was spring. Trees were sprouting leaves. Meadows were green. Every morning birds sang in their own sweet language, and the world was joyful. And the son of the widowed lady, living alone in the barren forest, rose and quickly saddled his hunting horse for himself, took 3 wooden spears, and thus equipped, rode away from his mother's house, intending to check on the plowman sowing oats in his mother's fields, a dozen oxen pulling 6 great plows. He entered the forest, and the heart deep inside him leapt with joy at the sweet season and the happy sound of birds singing from trees all around. Everything pleased him. To savor this peaceful moment, he slipped the bridle from his horse's head, letting him graze in the fresh green grass, then played with the wooden spears he could throw so well, hurling some behind him, some in front, some high in the air, then down and up and down again, until he heard 5 knights, all fully armed, riding through the forest and making an immense racket as, over and over, branches of oak trees and elms clattered against the heavy metal. Mail shirts clinked and clanked, spears banged on shields, and in shields and armor wood creaked and iron rang. The boy could hear but could not see who was coming so quickly. Stunned, he said to himself, "By my soul, my mother was right, saying that in all the world there was nothing so fearsome as devils. And to teach me how to behave, she told me to cross myself when I see them. But that's too much to ask. Instead of crossing myself, I'll stick the biggest and strongest with one of these wooden spears, and none of the others will come anywhere near me." Well, see, that's his first mistake right there.
It actually is in a nutshell. So these are the opening lines of the poem, and to teach people kind of how to read medieval literature, beginnings are important. And the other thing that's really important to stick to pay attention to are names. So if we look at this, we find that the first person who is named in the story is the widowed lady. So there's the son and the widowed lady. Okay? The mother, Perceval's mother, obviously the son is Perceval, though Perceval doesn't know he's Perceval. And in fact, nobody in the story knows he's Perceval or will know that until quite late in the poem. Okay? But so he starts out as the son of the widowed lady. And then his mother is the widowed lady. His mother never gets a name in this poem. In later retellings of the poem, she's given a name, but in Chrétien's, she doesn't have one. So Perceval begins the story totally without identity.
Yeah,
and this is really key.
Empty vessel.
Yeah, this is key to understanding. He's not just an empty vessel. He's sort of a wild man.
Okay.
So
unformed.
This is important to understanding how you would do a mystagogical reading or what a mystagogically shaped story would look like. Right? Is that you always begin down here, right, in the floodwaters, in the thorns of the world, right? Because you haven't yet begun to ascend the mountain of paradise. And one of the things that you don't know is your name. So Perceval begins, you could almost say it's kind of like the beginning in the Orthodox Church, it's the beginning of Lent, right? Where Adam is outside of paradise weeping, right? And he's been cut off from God.
Or likewise, it's birth, right? Like the very first prayer that a new child receives. And this, by the way, everybody, is the prayer of the making of a catechumen. There's other things in our books that, I don't know, this garbling has happened over time, that say prayers at the making of catechumens, which aren't. Okay. I mean, don't at me, bro, but they're not. The prayer of the naming, the 8th day naming prayer, is the prayer that makes someone a catechumen. And so, yeah, it's this kind of new being that, as you said, is not yet named. So yeah, you can see this Adam sitting outside of paradise, but also like this is a new birth, a new boy, wild. Right. I mean, as all young boys are, or should be. Anyway.
But here's the thing that he's missing that young boys have, or that we have an infant child right now who has not yet been baptized. It's coming up in a couple of weeks. But the thing that they have, which Perceval doesn't, is a father. So Perceval only knows himself in relation to his mother, making his name. And so a little bit later on, when he's talking to the knights, he tries to sort of fight them. Obviously, that's not going to work. And so he starts talking to them, and eventually they ask him some questions about himself, and we find out that they say, "Well, what's your name?" And he says, "Well, my name is Dear Son."
Yeah.
Okay, well, what do the servants at your house call you? Well, they call me Dear Master. Right?
When I've been told by my Greek friends that that newborns, often until they're baptized, are just called baby.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
That's not totally unusual in a lot of cultures, right?
Yeah.
So, the thing is that the giving of a name, traditionally, the giving of a name, and certainly in these kinds of stories, the giving of a name is the role of the father, right? It's a
Yeah.
fatherly role. It's a priestly
Right.
role.
It's
Right.
Adam's role. Adam names
Right.
all the animals.
And those are two things, fathers and priests. Those are two things which Perceval does not have in his life. And so he only knows himself in relation to his mother or to his servants, like the household servants, but he doesn't know himself in relation to his father. And we're told right at the beginning that Perceval's mother has told him that his father is a knight who died of grief, or maybe died in battle, died of grief because two of his sons were killed in battle. And he had received this grave wound in the loins from a spear. Now, I will just tell you, if you're talking about grave wounds in the loins in medieval literature, this is always a euphemism for castration.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which means then like his father is unmanned.
Right.
He's not
So
fatherly anymore.
the question of who Perceval's father actually is and what really happened to him is something we'll come back to a little bit later. But this is what he knows about his father, or this is all he knows about his father. And so we see his identity is also imaged. This is also important for the kind of the mystagogical reading of the story. It's also imaged by his clothing. So he dresses like a Welshman, which is to say in these rough garments of skin. By the way, from Chrétien, this is not to say you look like a Welshman, not a compliment in
Right.
continental France.
Yeah. I mean, that's saying you're one of those barbarians over there. Yeah.
Right. And then you can also see his activity, right? He's got this javelin, he's just sort of tossing it in every direction, right? The point of this is that his focus is completely scattered, right?
Yeah.
You could say he's ripe material for becoming a catechumen, right? At many parishes around the US right now. And I don't mean that in a bad or a disparaging way,
Sure.
but certainly you've seen, and I've seen, young men who are drawn to their church, who come into the church, and they don't know who they are.
Yeah,
Very
there's
often,
a certain wildness, frankly.
yeah, right. And what this story is about is how do you ascend the mountain? Because wildness can become strength. And it can become actually this really useful, beautiful asset to God and to the church and to the people in your community, right? But it has to be properly integrated into the hierarchy. And so here the change, the movement upwards in the hierarchy of being comes first, it begins with a theophany, which is this encounter with beauty. So in this case, it's the knights. Perceval first mistakes them for demons because he hears them. Then he sees them and he says, no, I was wrong. They must be angels.
Yeah,
Because he's never seen anything so beautiful. In fact, when he goes up to them, he says, are you God? Because I've been told God is the most beautiful thing, and you're the most beautiful thing that I've ever seen.
Yeah, and a significant piece of the backstory here is that, his dad, of course, is supposedly a knight, but he's never seen one. He doesn't know what a knight is, and his mother has been very deliberately not telling him. Because she doesn't...
Right.
She doesn't want that. She doesn't want him to go off and do that.
Yes, that is one of the reasons she's not telling him.
Yeah, of course.
That's one of
But
the
reasons. So when he sees knights, he doesn't know what they are. That's why he says, are you God? You must be angels.
Right.
He just doesn't even know. He doesn't even know. They're just these shiny, clattery things,
And so when he finds out what they are, and he finds out you're a knight, that's when he's given his purpose. And now the only thing he wants to do is to be one of them. And Perceval is really fascinated, for instance, by the strange gear that the knights are wearing. And this will become very important to the poem. Because this question for each piece of gear, and I'm not going to read the whole passage, I'll read a little bit of it, just so you get a sense of the dialogue with the knights. But in the poem, it's quite long. It takes many dozens of lines, and it's a little annoying. Because his question with each piece of what the knights are wearing is, how does it serve you? Right? This question is going to become important later on in the story. So his heart is filled with this desire for knighthood. Just to read this a little bit, it says, and the boy said to the knight who told him so many things, sir, the knights and the girls came riding along this way, but now tell me about the king who makes people knights, and where I'm likely to find him. Fellow, said the king, I can tell you the king's court is at Carlisle, which used to be where Arthur had his court. And just 5 days ago, that's where he was, because I was there and I saw him. But if he's gone, When you get there, there'll be plenty of people to guide you. No matter how far he's traveled, they'll be able to help you find him. And now I ask you, tell me please, what name should I know you by? Sir, was the answer. I'll tell you, I'm called Dear Son. Dear Son? Yes, but I'm sure you have another name. Oh yes, I'm called Dear Brother. I believe you, but if you'll tell me the truth, I'd like to know your real name. Sir, was the answer. I'll tell you, of course. They call me Good Master. A really fine name, by God, and you have no other? No, I've never had any other. I'm hearing strange things, by God, the strangest I've ever heard, and I'll never hear any stranger. And then, anxious to catch the others who had gone ahead, he galloped off like the wind, and the boy went hurrying home to the house he'd always lived in, where his mother was waiting and worrying, for her son had not returned when he should.
I have to say, I really like the way that the knight responds to him.
Yes.
You know, in this, it's very like he's not being condescending at all.
Yes. Yes.
He's like, "Oh, that's a great name. Do you have another one?" You know,
one might also say,
other...
he's being courteous.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So Perceval goes back to his mother and questions her. And this is the first time he learns about his father, who's this crippled knight pierced through the thighs, or it's really like between the buttocks is literally what it means. Again, this is just, it means castration. And that because he was wounded in this way, he couldn't defend his lands or his fortune when King Uther Pendragon died, and had to be carried on a litter because he couldn't ride a horse, and then eventually dies with this broken heart. So seeing that she cannot dissuade him from his intent to become a knight, Perceval's mother, who laments that he will probably be killed because there was no one to teach him how to fight, she gives him certain instructions. And this is the beginning of Perceval's catechesis. And he will, in fact, receive these instructions or some version of them multiple times throughout the story. And each time they're changed a little bit. So it's very important to pay attention. Anytime you're reading an ancient or a medieval text where there is a repetition or a list, and especially when there's a repetition of a list, it is something you should pay attention to.
Yeah.
So the first instruction is to give aid to any lady he meets.
Yeah, this is like one of these core,
right?
Like this is what chivalry is, kind of thing. You know.
Right.
Yeah.
And certainly one can keep in mind, Count Philip, famously chivalric, crusader, count, all these other things. He's the patron of this story, and chivalry is the thing that he's interested in. But as one can sort of see by his, the fact that he's a crusader, there's also a relationship between your sort of secular duties as a knight or as a nobleman of the court, and then also the fealty that you owe to God, and the question of how to work those two things out. That's one of the things that a lot of the Arthurian stories are about, because we always know that at the end of the day, you actually have to pick one of those things. And that is why most of the best Arthurian knights, including Lancelot himself, die as monastics.
Yeah. And I think
also a lot of our sainted emperors.
Indeed. And a number of British kings, or princes and various other kinds of nobles. I mean, I think one of the things I think it's important to note here is that, like, chivalry. I mean, this is a whole kind of sidebar, about chivalry, but I'll at least say that one of the elements of what chivalry is, it's an attempt to Christianize the fact that some men in a society need to be violent for that society to be able to continue, right? But they're Christians, so you can't it's not just no holds barred. It's not just whoever wins. There are no rules.
Might makes right. Yeah.
Might makes right. Might makes right is not a Christian value. So chivalry, which of course, I mean, there's lots of versions of chivalry over time in different places, and some are very messed up. But the idea is that it's putting limitations on people whose lives maybe are about, or at least significantly include, violence.
I think I've said this.
There's rules, you guys. There's rules.
I think I've said this more than once, but the main problem that most societies have to figure out how to handle is, what do you do with your single young males?
Right.
That's the main problem that civilization in general is always trying to solve. Right. And in the sort of
I was
the
just-
pre-Christian, pre-monarchical society in Western Europe, I mean, the main body, like body polity, is the idea of the heap in Anglo-Saxon. There's a
The
Celtic
heap.
word for it as well. Yeah, but it's like it's the war band,
Yeah,
right? It's the war band. These are predominantly young, combat capable males who kind of sort of would run in packs. And if you have a
Right.
good king, then he's somebody who can figure out how to turn them not again inward against his own people, but sort of outward against your people's enemies. And if you can do that, then you're a successful leader of your war band.
Yeah, and I mean, and it's notable that the first instruction here, it's not only don't hurt women, which in the pagan world, there's hurting women is part of the way that society works.
Right.
You know, it's not just don't hurt women, like don't hurt women. It's actually a positive commandment, which is give aid to any lady that you meet. Like you have an obligation to them. You know, that's pretty interesting.
Right. So let me go through the list of instructions because it is very important.
I just wanted to point out
Perceval-
that one in particular.
Yeah. And basically another little tip for reading old stories, especially stories that are kind of a fairy tale or have a fairy tale like quality, although we all know how I feel about that term, is whenever somebody is given a list of instructions, they will almost certainly never follow the instructions correctly.
Yeah.
At the beginning, you can do everything but eat the one fruit. What do we immediately do? Yeah. So here's the list of
one
things.
job.
First of all, give aid to any lady you meet. The second is, and this is a tricky one, which we'll probably talk about in a future episode when we do the Sir Gawain story. But the second one is to accept any token he's given from a lady, but he's never supposed to accept more than a kiss. So the implication there is you're going to meet some ladies and they're going to want to give you things. And you should take any of those things up to a kiss and nothing further. Okay?
Yeah.
Everybody
Right.
understand? All right. The next one is that you are supposed to ask the name of any man who shows you hospitality, since, and this is a direct quote, it is by the name that you know the man. Keep in mind, Perceval does not know his name. He hasn't even been told it by his mother because his mother, in the pattern of the story, his mother is not even really can't give him the name, right? Mm-hmm. So, but you're supposed to ask the name of any man who shows you hospitality. And then finally, the final instruction, and this will seem, this won't seem as important as the others for people who are not steeped in this world, but it's very important that Perceval is instructed to stop and pray at any church or any chapel that he comes across. So Perceval doesn't know actually what a church or a chapel is. He asks, and he's told, because he's never seen one, he's been taught the creed and some prayers, and to cross himself if he sees a demon, which of course he doesn't do, but he's never been to church. And so he's told that it is a place, quote, filled with relics, treasures holy, wherein they offer up the body of Jesus Christ. By the way, this is my operational definition of a church. Is it full of relics and treasures wherein they offer up the body and blood of Jesus Christ? If not,
It's
certainly
some
not
other-
something that Perceval would have recognized as a church. Of course, the idea here, the joke is that it's not a joke. It's the tragedy of the story is that Perceval will not do any of these things correctly, and when he does try to do them, they go wrong. So Perceval does not yet have an identity. He doesn't yet have a name, nor does he know how to act in the new world that he's entered. So this introduces a theme that we're going to see repeat itself over and over again in the poem, which is that as Perceval climbs the ontological hierarchy, that he lacks the information, he lacks the manners that he will need to move in that particular rung of the ladder. So because of this, he's got to rely on the advice that he gets from the guardian of each threshold. So each threshold of the ontological ladder, you could say as he moves into the liturgy, there's a different person that is gatekeeping that next section, the next section of the mountain, right? And we can think about, thinking about baptism and the initiation of the church, right? It corresponds to the entrance of the church, the beginning of catechesis, the first step on the ascent up the mountain. And so one of the first things we're told is that Perceval is clothed in new garments, although they are once again garments of skin. And then he crosses a river as he leaves. And if I had a whole lot more time to go over this today, I would show you how rivers correspond to vales in these kinds of stories.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's a very important correspondence in Perceval's story. So he puts on a garment. It's a garment of skin, right? And then he crosses the river. And the change of garments in the story, which is always accompanied, by the way, in Chrétien's story by the crossing of a river, the change of garment signals a way that an old identity has been removed and a new identity has been put on. Anybody who's ever seen a baptism should understand this.
Yeah, and I think I was gonna say I think that one of the good things I think that this teaches us is I don't know. I think modern people often, like our sense of realism in storytelling, we have a sense that in many cases that details like this, like crossing a river, changing garments,
Right.
that details like this, they provide a kind of texture that makes it feel more real or whatever. But in medieval storytelling, and then frankly, because medieval storytelling is Christian storytelling, right? In medieval storytelling, but Christian storytelling, the Bible itself, but even non-Christian stuff from that period, like pagan storytelling too, details are never accidental. You know, the idea that they're just sort of there to provide kind of color or whatever is just not a thing. Maybe some don't matter a whole lot, but you should assume that they're there for a reason. Not that they're there because someone thought that that would be a nice detail to add. You know, like, oh, that makes it, you know, a little ornament or whatever. It's generally, you should always ask what's going on here. What does this mean? Why is this in the story? Because it's written that way. And as you pointed out, there's a pattern where there's new garments and crossing over rivers. This is not an accident.
Yeah, there are a couple of ways you can do that. One is to just say, oh, look, a pattern has been repeated multiple times. That must mean something. The other thing to say, though, is that it is not terribly important for the purposes of what we're doing today, whether or not Chrétien sat down and deliberately thought about all of this, right? I certainly don't believe that he was sitting there. Now, again, maybe he actually has a copy of St. Germanus of Constantinople's mystagogical commentary in the Divine Liturgy. If he does, this would be a big, there's no way to prove it, but it is a theory that's out there, and there are reasons to suspect it might be true.
By the way, kids, you can order translations of that for yourself and read it. It's not a long book. It's actually not a difficult book.
It's not a long book. It's not a difficult book. It's really beautiful. I think there was a time when mystagogical interpretations of the Divine Liturgy sort of fell out of favor in Anglophone Orthodoxy. Father Alexander Schmemann famously did not like them. But they're a really strong part of the tradition. Like it's Saint Maximus the Confessor's best book. I don't know what else to tell you. So anyway, all right. Yeah, let's rant over. But all right, we'll continue. So,
10-second anti-Schmemann rant.
yeah, I'm not really anti-Schmemann.
I'm just kidding.
I just
we have a cordial, courteous disagreement.
Yeah, in this particular case, and may I have his prayers is all I will say, because definitely a much greater man than I am. But in this case, I disagree with him. All right, so Perceval's first few encounters. So we could say in the mystagogical reading, Perceval has now moved into the narthex, right? He stopped being like a total wild man, but he still has not actually figured out how to behave in church. And in fact, yesterday I was doing a conversation with Matthew Namey, our mutual friend, and John Heers, and we were talking about and I said, listen, my first catechetical lesson is always, here's how you walk into church. Right? Because so much of what it means to be an Orthodox Christian isn't just about changing your ideas, or it's not just about changing your, the things you think, or I'm going to abandon these positions and adopt these new positions. It really is about a totally embodied way of life. And so I always like to begin with, here's how you walk into church as an Orthodox Christian. Here's how you walk into church. Here's how you behave. Because everything else you learn about being a Christian is going to happen here. So you need to know how to act. So Perceval's first few encounters, we could say he's in the narthex now, but his first few encounters in the world of chivalry do not go well. So he meets a maiden. She'll come up later. And instead of simply receiving her ring as a free gift, he misinterprets his mother's instructions, and so he takes the ring and then he takes a kiss, like forcibly kisses her, which is not great, right? And this causes a rift between her and her jealous lover, who believes that she has been unfaithful to him. Perceval also meets a particularly troublesome knight known as the Red Knight. The Red Knight, very importantly, has stolen Arthur's cup from which he and his retainers drink, and it has fractured the communion at Arthur's court. And so, which is, again, kind of one of the main themes of the poem. Something which is really useful to watch for as you read the poem also is speech and silence. So in Camelot, there's a heavy silence that lays on everybody except for Sir Kay, who is great in some of the early Celtic stuff. Kay is like Arthur's best buddy and really reliable. Yeah. And then basically every time he's a jobber, if that makes sense, right? Every time you want to, it's a little pro wrestling term for people out there. A jobber is a guy who used to be great, but now his main thing that he does is he takes the reputation he used to have and he uses it to put new guys over with the audience. And so that's what Kay is. Basically in all the later stories, certainly in all the French stories, anytime Kay comes up, who is obviously, a kinsman of Arthur or his foster brother, whenever Kay shows up, it's usually as kind of like the butt of the joke or as a jobber to kind of put over because Kay, he's like Arthur's oldest friend, he's Knight of the Round Table, so you can't say he's garbage, but also we have our new heroes coming along and we need to show that they're really serious to deal with.
I mean, in the later versions, like for instance, the Kay you get in the Sword and the Stone is a jerk, basically, and kind of, I mean, like even in as I recall, because a lot of this stuff gets mixed up in your head, what is Arthur? It's adaptations of adaptations of adaptations of adaptations of expansions of it, it's. But I think in Mallory, as I recall, like Kay, if I'm remembering correctly, like Kay is kind of a violent jerk.
Sometimes he is, because Mallory is pulling from so many different sources. Yeah. Sometimes Kay is pretty sympathetic, and other times he's a jerk. Yeah. So basically everybody is silent in Camelot or in Arthur's court. It's like not actually Camelot, but except for Kay, who's the king's seneschal, who he disparages. He laughs at Perceval because of Perceval's bad manners, which include things like riding his horse right into the king's banquet hall. Now,
which seems to be a thing that happens in Camelot.
You just don't let anybody ride in through that door. I will tell you sometime privately my most embarrassing story about the first time I met my spiritual father and the ridiculous things that I said. So we've all been that guy. Like, we've all ridden the horse right into the king's banquet hall, having no idea what's going on, right? And so this sets up a rivalry between Perceval and Kay, which is kind of part of the story. So when the Red Knight steals the king's cup, one of the things that he'd done is sort of spilled and splashed the wine all over Queen Guinevere. How do I put this delicately? So one of the big things that is important in this poem is the failures to integrate the feminine. And in particular, what I haven't mentioned is that Perceval, the story of the Grail, is actually about Perceval and Gawain. And the story alternates in between them. And I'm only telling you the Perceval half today, because there's just no way. In fact, we're not even going to finish the Perceval half today. I'm just going to say that right now. We're going to get a little bit further, and then we'll pick it up next episode.
I think so.
Because
there's so much.
Yeah, because there's some parallels between and I will talk about these in the next episode. I will talk about the parallels.
No, there's too much. Let me sum
up. That's right. Another princess. You've done 0 Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
That's not true. That's not true.
What is? Maybe I forgot which one. But anyway, you just got to step up the references here. Okay. All right.
Well, by the way, I should mention that the chat has been very chatty.
Yeah, I noticed that.
And one person asked about. Sivana asked about violent rabbits.
Yes.
And I mentioned, see, the thing you're wearing.
The violent rabbit thing is kind of marginal to this story, and so I don't
sure, but nonetheless,
that was a pun, Father.
Thank you,
because they're in marginalia.
Yeah.
So it's a marginal. Okay, never mind.
That's what I was going to say. Is like you get to wear a Monty Python T-shirt, and I mean I have to wear the exact same thing every time, which is fine. But I do own a T-shirt that is the Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch T-shirt,
Yes.
and actually has bunnies on it.
Do you have it on
and-
under your cassock right now?
You'll never. I mean, who knows?
You tell me after the show. Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah, after the show. Yeah.
But one thing I pointed out, I said there's actually there's actually quite a lot of rabbits being violent towards humans in
Right.
manuscript illuminations in the Middle Ages. And she said, do you think that Monty Python knew that? I was like, actually, if you watch the Holy Grail and you are a medievalist that's looked into a lot of this stuff, it's clear that there's a whole lot of research that went
Right.
into that movie. So
Right.
it's not just a dopey, I mean, it is a dopey treatment of the Grail stories, but it's actually a lot.
Yes.
It's a very smart, very nerdy.
Monty Python and the Quest for the Holy Grail. I mean, we could do an episode on it someday.
That would be
It is.
interesting, yeah.
It actually very beautifully integrates a lot of interesting trends in medieval studies from the time when it was made, and that would be something only I am interested in talking about. But we could.
No,
we could
I am,
do it
because
sometime. Well, I know,
as I told you before we began, the number one film in the United States of America on the day that I was born
right.
is Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
That's right. That's right. Okay. All right. So let me go back to Guinevere and the weird thing. Okay.
Okay, Guinevere.
So the wine spilled in Guinevere's lap has to do with menstruation.
Okay.
And the thing to understand is that in medieval storytelling, that makes a woman unavailable.
Yeah.
Like, and also like in most traditional societies. The reason this is important.
Yeah.
The reason this is important is because it has to do with the poem has a lot of different unavailable women, and it has a lot of castrated men. Right? And that is one of the difficulties of bringing the masculine and the feminine back together. And the ways that this is necessary for communion and healing to happen is one of the main things that the poem seems to be about. It is also one of the things that happens in the Divine Liturgy, right? Which is the healing and the communion of creation. In the Orthodox Church, I mean, obviously we have the Mother of God, right? Who is queen, right? She's virgin and therefore sort of inaccessible, impregnable, but also mother, so the source of life. Well, other than her, she's the only person who's ever been those things, right? Other than her, everybody else in this story, right, is some fracturing of that. So there's the mother who's a widow, right, who is Perceval's inability to properly integrate with his mother is the reason for his sin in the Grail Castle, which we'll get to apparently next week at this point.
Next time,
There's the young woman who he sort of forces himself on here, although fortunately no further than a kiss. He misunderstood his mother's instructions, but at least not as badly as could have been. And then there's Guinevere, and the Guinevere thing in the background. It's not foregrounded in the poem very often. But then there's also the whole thing with Gawain and the test of the bed, which is the other half of the poem, which again we will not talk about today, which also has to do with two women who Gawain will manage to, I'll just spoil it, successfully passes the test, and because of that he's able to join with the feminine, inherit the family castle, communion is restored, healing happens. Perceval is the masculine side of the healing that is supposed to happen. And that will fail to happen or does it, as we're going to see at the end of the poem. Okay,
yeah, and
so
I want to add two things to everything you just said, actually. So, like on the one hand, I think it would be easy to interpret a lot of this symbolism as being simply about fertility, right? And that's not wrong.
Yeah,
but it's also not enough. It's not
right. That's right. Yeah,
sort of just fertility. It's about life as a much larger thing, right? And divine life in particular, because again, this is a Christian poem. The other thing I wanted to mention, even though we're not doing Gawain or Gowan or however you want to pronounce it.
Both are
I-
valid.
Yeah, I at least wanted to say that when I was in Wales last summer, being taken around by Father Jacob Siemens, who's a priest in Cardiff, wonderful, wonderful man, wonderful priest. Highly recommend his community, his parish community there in Cardiff. And one of the places we went to was a chapel right next to the ocean called St. Govan's Chapel. And it is said that St. Govan is buried underneath the altar there.
Mm.
And so, we're going there. And
a church is a place with relics.
exactly, just like Perceval had been told. And it is wedged in between like parts of a cliff, essentially. And you have to almost kind of climb down a part of a cliff to get there. There's steps, but they're very steep, very irregular, very difficult. And then when you get to the chapel, then what's beyond it is basically lots and lots of rocks until you get down to the ocean. It is a stunning, stunning sight. Stunning sight. So here's the interesting thing. So I looked up, I was like, okay, I don't know who this is. So St. Govan's Chapel is on the way, like if you're heading west from Cardiff to Pembrokeshire, where St. David's is out on the southwestern point of Wales. That's where it is. So it's on the southern coast of Wales. And so I just said, okay, I don't know this saint. I need to look him up. I need to know who he is. I was like, okay, he's clearly a monastic hermit, whatever. Apparently, there are indeed legends, tales, stories, traditions, I don't know what word you want to use, that this is Sir Gawain.
Oh, no kidding.
Who went there and finished out his life.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
As a monastic. And there are stories about like pirates coming and all this kind of stuff. But I mean, this connects with what you were talking about earlier about these important figures like ending their lives as monks or nuns, and again, it's not it illustrates this point that it's not about fertility per se, it's about life. And that he's kind of advanced beyond even solving the fertility problem to he's reached a highest form of life possible for him in this world. So yeah, Father Jacob and I, we went there with one of my sons, and we stood there and in the midst of this, I mean, it's a little chapel, like it's very small. Like you've been in my studio here where I am now, which is 200 square feet. It's like half the size, maybe not even a third of the size of my studio. Like maybe 50, 60 square feet or something like that. But we stood there and we sang the hymn to St. Govan. So I don't know. I can't say this is Sir Gawain, but like, I really need it to be.
Gawain is certainly probably the earliest or second earliest character in the whole thing. He's also, unfortunately, I say unfortunately because I really like him, especially in the Celtic stuff, but he's also another example of a jobber where he starts out in these early stories really favorably, and then as the French stuff happens, and especially the Lancelot Grail cycle, which is a little bit after Chrétien, he basically becomes a foil for Lancelot to sort of show all the ways that Lancelot succeeds as a great knight while Gawain fails. And so it's because like Gawain was the best sort of Welsh knight, and so when the French writers are introducing here's our best French knight, then they have to make the previous best guy kind of look bad. But he's certainly a heroic figure in this poem, and I am working. This is not an announcement, okay?
Uh-oh. A revelation.
It's not an official announcement, but I'm currently in the planning stages for a series of probably 7 novels retelling the Arthurian cycle that I'm going to be working on for the next few years and publishing. And
I want to be a character.
If it all happens, if it all works out, Gawain is going to be very important, because one of the things that I want to do is actually try to integrate both versions of him.
You should definitely have him end up in a chapel off of a cliff off the southern coast of Wales.
I'll definitely take the notes. By the way, there's also a canonized Welsh saint who was King Arthur's I want to say daughter or niece, one of the two. But she did. I always, you find it in when you're reading her life as it comes around every year, and it's like, oh yeah, and her. I think it was her uncle. I think King Arthur was her uncle, and it's just sort of matter of factly mentioned in the hagiography, which I think is really nice.
Yeah.
Okay, so, anywho, all right, so, Perceval. So there's this thing that's happening in Camelot, which I'll try to talk a little more about next time. But Perceval goes out, manages to kill the Red Knight in combat. But he's not able to remove his armor because he still doesn't know how any of it works. And so he's going to require the help of somebody else to remove the Red Knight's armor, put it on himself, and then this begins his chivalric career. And all of this is not without some regret. Like he has some regret once he puts on now he's wearing the armor. Then he looks over and he sees the clothes that his mother gave him, right? And these garments of skin that he brought. Lying there on the ground, right? And he feels some sorrow over this because he's leaving an identity behind, right? And the identity he's leaving behind is dear son, right? He's leaving that identity behind, and he's beginning a move up the ontological ladder, right? And it's accompanied by another mentor and the crossing of another river. And so this would bring us, in our mystagogical reading, this would bring us to the liturgy of the faithful, or the liturgy of the sacrament. Sometimes,
and this is probably a good place.
That's what I was just thinking. I think this would be a good time. So I promise to fully pay off, if not in part 2, certainly in part 6 or part 7. But I promise to fully pay off everything that I promised today, including the sort of surprising truth about Perceval's parentage.
Yeah, yeah. Well, bringing that up, so it's time to check in with the chat. We've mentioned some stuff from the chat earlier, but a donation was given. Another donation was given.
Oh, boy. All right, hold on.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, so this one comes with a question. So this is from Stephen Young. And he says, Eschenbach's Perceval, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing this, says that Gamure is his father. Is that something that he drew from earlier adventures, or is that the first place this is seen? So that's what I don't know the answer to that. Maybe you do, because you know this material a lot better than I do. Who's his dad? I mean, I don't. Should we wait for who's your daddy to
Yeah, let's talk about that next time. That is something that Perceval introduces, and this becomes this is something Perceval does when it becomes much more important that the Grail is the cup that was at the Last Supper, or in Perceval it's the cup with which Joseph of Arimathea caught the blood of Christ when he was on the cross. Yeah. Which is not the case in Chrétien. So we will talk about that a little bit next time. But yeah,
there's another fun set of questions. So Sam Cook, and then also Dr. Serena Higgins has joined us in the chat.
Old professor.
Yes. So Sam Cook asks, "Is Perceval is Perceval Anakin Skywalker?" And then he offers as a piece of evidence that Anakin's first encounter with a Jedi Knight involved the question, "Are you an angel?" Although he wasn't asking that of the Jedi. That was of the older woman that he would be involved with later. And then so Dr. Higgins, she says it's the other way around. Anakin is Perceval, which
I don't think Anakin is Perceval, but that's a
long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. You never know. About
it's a fun question. I think there may be other mythological figures that sort of fit the mold a little bit better for Anakin.
Yeah, I mean, so Stephen Young adds to that. He says that I can't say this with a straight face. He says that Perceval has medieval chlorians, not midichlorians.
Gross.
I know.
Disgusting. Oh, you should be ashamed of yourself. Okay.
I feel like Stephen should have to give another donation because he said that. I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. Medieval chlorians. Oh, gosh. Yeah, lots of stuff on the symbolism of the wine in Gawain's lap.
Dr. Higgins had several things to say about that were really interesting.
It's one of the things that I try to do when I'm reading a story like Perceval is to, as much as possible, only operate from the information that's within the poem. So it's how much of a Lancelot Guinevere thing is already going on. I mean, Chrétien, he's got Knight of the Cart, but even then, it's more of a kind of a courtly love affair. Like the action. Anyway, things get more adulterous as you go, basically. And so, how much of that does he have in mind when he's writing the story? That's not totally clear. What is clear is that there's a huge problem with fertility at the court of Arthur. And again, I got to really stress, this is not just about sex. Sex is about fertility.
In most of human history.
Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah. Sorry, my bad. You're right, though. Yeah. What I mean by that is like all things that have to do with fertility are not about sex, but sex is always about fertility, or should be, right? And so the when you're talking about something like Guinevere's unavailability, that happens because of this rupture of communion at the court, and the rupture of communion is related to, I mean, obviously in symbolic terms, certainly in the terms that are used in the scriptures and the church fathers, the act of communion is the consummation of the mystical marriage, right? And so the connection between communion and consummation, and the fact that there's something wrong with Arthur's marriage, which certainly is always the case. It doesn't, even before Lancelot ever maybe gets introduced to the thing, there's something wrong with Arthur's marriage. There's something wrong with his relationship with his nephew, who's also his son, which is something we'll come back to next week.
And it's notable, right? Like all of these people are reading the scriptures in Latin. When Jesus is on the cross and he's about to give up his spirit, he says in Latin, "Consummatum est."
Yeah.
Which gets translated, to telestai, or whatever it is in Greek, which, is related to the word telos, meaning end or purpose, right? Teleology. But, in Latin, consummatum est, so it is finished, but you could also say it is consummated, it is completed, it has reached its purpose, whatever. But like, absolutely, medieval period people would have understood consummation with all of these layers.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. It's just a natural way to think about the world, and there's so many things in our society that are sick and diseased, which make we sort of like just see sex in its own category, right? Among other things, right? That's one of the problems. It's sort of seeing it as the thing that doesn't actually have anything to do doesn't necessarily have anything to do with raising the family or all these other things, doesn't really necessarily have anything to do with intimacy or communion with a person, right? All these different problems. And so because of that, you can really, if you bring that to the table when you're reading these kinds of stories, you can really go sideways.
Yeah, but I mean, think about our 21st century narrative in these terms, right? It's definitely hitting down. So it goes from, and it's because we've achieved this kind of technological mastery over fertility, or so we think. Yep. It goes from, the model that you just described, which is fertility is about building the family and so forth. And therefore, that's what sex is for in its greatest sense. And then it goes to, okay, this is something you can do with someone if you really love them.
Right.
Like if you really have this strong emotional connection or whatever, and then now you get to hookup culture, in which it's literally just, I want to have a physical feeling.
Yeah, I sort of blame. I don't know if it's a symptom or a cause, but in my mind, I always sort of blame the American sitcom as a genre for this, at least partly.
You mentioned that. But one time I made a big mistake, and I made it for a long time. And that big mistake was, I could see that the sitcom Friends had made a significant impact in American culture. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to watch this thing. I had never I'd seen a few episodes, whatever. I'm going to watch this thing. And because, we're in the age of the binge, I watched all of it from start to finish.
Oh, no.
And, the
best way to do that, by the way, is you can go on YouTube and find where people have edited the laugh track out. and then you just realize that everybody in the show is actually a raging sociopath.
Right? And so I watched the whole show. I mean, I watched the whole show. Like I said, it was a mistake that I continued to make over a long period of time. Because it's like, I don't know, was it 9 seasons or 10 seasons? I can't remember, 8 seasons. I watched the whole thing. I came away at the end of it, though, and I'm not going to say that it's like a cause, because all these things are interlaced, okay? But it is a fascinating study in the way that people understand relationships, sex. One of the things that really struck me, especially watching it, like binging it, is how much it trivialized porn. Actually,
oh, interesting.
Like pornography. Pornography shows up over and over again in the show, and it's treated as kind of cute, but desirable, and a little embarrassing, but like not this viciously horrible thing that it actually is, where it rewrites your brain and destroys your relationships, and whatever, as they call it, the new drug. So it was an interesting study, but I can tell you that just
Ancient Faith Media has a great book about this, by the way. That's not just about pornography; it's about other things.
Oh yes, from object to icon.
From object to icon. Really, I mean, honestly, I would just say, like, if you're a young man or even a young woman watching this, you should just immediately go buy that book.
Yeah. Yes, very worth it. But one of the other things, the experiences that I had in watching that was like I felt. I got to the end, and of course I had a sense of like, okay, now I'm done. But I also was just a sense of like I needed to go cleanse myself.
Yeah. There's a sacrament for this.
Yeah. Not that I'm saying that I think that, I don't know, maybe it should have been confessed. I don't know. But contrast that, right, with what we're getting in this poem,
right,
with what we're getting in the Arthurian legendarium in general, which is, I know a lot of it is about family and fertility and the kingdom and all of this kind of stuff, and how it's subverted in so many ways.
Yep.
Like it's in some ways it's telling the same story,
right?
The same kind of what the Greeks would have called porneia, right? But it shows how it's going wrong. It shows what the consequences are.
I'll spoil next episode for everybody. Okay. So this is what you have to look forward to.
I mean, there's
Perceval's half of the story is about how the mystery of communion, of confession and communion, how the mystery of confession and communion will heal your relationship with your father, Adam. And Gawain's story is about how the mystery of marriage will heal your relationship with your mother, Eve. And that is what the story is about. Yeah. So lots more to say about this. Arturian, I see that just gave a donation.
It has a t-shirt in the image.
Given the emoji, I guess I have to buy a new shirt. So that's great. Thank you very much for your donation. All money donated to the show will just go to Ancient Faith to support the ministry, and I'll buy the shirts. So thank you very, very much. And yeah, okay. Well, we're right at 90 minutes, and so I think we'll pick up again.
Yeah, I'm always happy to do a part 2.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and Dr. Higgins says it's also about the kingdom of God, the church, right? But that's the only place where confession, communion, marriage can happen. So that's the point. It's the point of the mysteries, that the church. I'll throw out a Schmemann quote here, that the church is the mystery, which contains all of the other mysteries. Yeah. All right. Any concluding thoughts, Father?
I remember, when I first encountered the Perceval story, I read, in fact, I wrote a little paper comparing a Welsh version with, actually I read a prose translation of Chrétien. And it was interesting to me how there were the commonalities, but also the differences. And, it's interesting that in the Welsh version, as I recall, because I haven't looked at this just recently, but as I recall in the Welsh version, it's a lot more fairy tale-ish in that it's not as complex. The characters are not quite as complex, and Perceval is much more kind of oafish at the beginning.
Yeah,
I think.
that's right.
You know, in some ways, like another character who's in some ways like this, and this might be an interesting thing to do, is Kullervo from the Kalevala, who is this oafish character. You know, although it's much more extreme in his case, like he's superhumanly strong, for instance, all this kind of thing. You know, and then to look at the way that, like, the instructions that his mother gives, how they play out differently in between the two stories. And but yeah, I think I think that there's a lot of ways that this story is a tale told for young men. I mean, although I mean honestly, as a man who's getting to be middle aged and on the edge of old man, tales told for young men are actually very useful for us older men as well. I think partly because I'm speaking out of my own experience here, but also my pastoral experience, and also talking with friends, that in a lot of ways, being, if you're, God willing, if you're trying to do it right, being middle-aged and older as a man, I can't speak for women's experience. Women will have to do that for themselves. But being middle-aged and older as a man is about learning how to repent of the ways that you messed it up and you failed and you didn't get it right when you were a younger man. Yeah. I mean, I remember, like, one of the things that came to me that was a significant moment in my life. Now, this was 10 years ago now, but my mother, 11 years old, 10 and a half years now, my mother died of brain cancer. And, with her condition, we actually had the opportunity to go and be with her in the weeks before she died. And, unlike many people at the end of their lives, she wasn't just simply sedated, which to me is one of the saddest things as a priest, is that almost everybody's life ends in sedation now. Yeah. Like, many people never get to give that last confession. Right. Or even receive their last communion. Yeah. But in any event, so my mother was not sedated. And I mean, obviously the last few days of her life, she was essentially asleep. But when we got to spend time with her, a number of weeks before she died. And one of the experiences that I had with her, I said to her, please forgive me for all of the trouble that I gave you as a young man. Yeah. And I thank God for that opportunity. I thank God for that. But yeah, I mean, when we say as Orthodox Christians that this life is about repentance, this is at least one of the things, right, that we mean. So that's one of the ways that this story has struck me today, particularly.
Yeah, it makes me think about the fact, this is not a Schmeminism, but it is a Hopkoism, since we're just doing that today. Father Thomas Hopko used to always talk about the importance of the fact. I think I've heard you and Father Stephen talk about this, that when St. Paul describes what is what our inheritance is as Orthodox Christians, he talks about that we're receiving the inheritance of sons, right? That everybody in God's house is a son, right? And that is one of the things that Perceval, the story of the Grail, is about, actually, is what it means to become a son, right? What it means to become a son and an heir according to the promise. And so that's a beautiful place to stop. I will say people are donating, so I feel like I have to read their comments still. So Samuel asks, mystagogical narrative writing masterclass when? So I don't have one of those planned, Samuel, but I will tell you, I do have a special universal history course planned for the end of February, which will be shortly announced. And in this course, one of the things that we will be doing will be looking at how to actually write stories within this framework. So maybe that will scratch your itch. And
that'll be through the symbolic donated, world.
Through the symbolic world. And then Stephen donated $2 as penance for a Star Wars pun. So
thank you.
You can see Father Andrew after class for absolution. Okay. All right, guys. Man, there's so much more awesome stuff to talk about here, but we'll get back to it in when is our next episode? It's 2 weeks from
I think
today?
it's in 2 weeks from today, if I recall
Okay,
correctly.
yeah, this has like been a weird January, and we had to move some of the episodes around, so I'm a little discombobulated now. But
yeah. I mean,
weeks from
probably Lent will be continued discombobulations, but we'll still be putting out 2 episodes a month, even if they're not always on the first and third Thursdays of the month.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, thanks for tuning in today for our first look at Arthurian legends. This is part 1 of like 60. If you were edified by this conversation, please like, subscribe. I just have to tell you, Father Andrew has this idea that we're just going to like pop around and do greatest hits. And I'm like, no. I just want to read the Iliad for a year with these people. Like, I just want to go forever on the one thing. No, it's okay. It's good. I need someone to rein me in. So if you were edified by this conversation, please like, subscribe, share, and review. The show's home is on YouTube, but we're also on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and other places where fine podcasts are sold.
And if you are watching on YouTube, make sure that you click that little bell when you subscribe so you get notified every time we put out a new episode, which, as we said, is twice a month. Next time we're going to do part 2 on Perceval and the Holy Grail and so forth. I don't know if there's going to be a part 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever. It just depends on how long.
At least just a part 2. Just a part 2. I can totally do this. I can
Probably
totally
part 2.
do this in one more episode.
But then after that, we're going to climb into a little boat and sail off into the mist as we introduce you to Richard's and one of my favorite poems of all time. A poem about a man named Beowulf,
who beats Battlestar Galactica. All right, well, farewell, everyone. May you always trace the silhouette of virtue in everything that you read.
And this has been a listener and viewer-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.